Hi everyone. I'm sure this video is going to be kind of controversial. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of differing opinions on this, and I don't know how many comments we're going to get that are going to be understanding of where I'm coming from or not. Let's see what happens. But I'm a big John Lennon fan. John's my favorite Beatle, and I've been very distressed over recent years of how he's been reduced in the press, on internet forums, everywhere you go, articles here and there, as nothing more than a so-called hypocrite, loser, wife beater, quote unquote, untalented, limited guitarist, unsympathetic person, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And while these traits of John Lennon are indeed part of his core personality, to an extent, it's not all he was. But yet, I'm very dismayed that it's becoming all he's remembered for. And I'm going to start this by mentioning Paul McCartney for a minute, in the sense that, when John Lennon was tragically murdered in 1980, the reverse happened for a number of years. It turned out that John was deified as some kind of a saint, some kind of a golden guy, a god who could do no wrong, was perfect. And Paul McCartney, justifiably so, was kind of put off by that. He once referred to John Lennon's memory sarcastically as if he was being treated as, quote, Martin Luther Lennon, unquote. And Paul all of a sudden found himself in the 1980s in a very odd position where everybody deemed John Lennon as, quote, the Beatles. The Beatles were all about John, and Paul was left in the dust, almost as John Lennon being Paul McCartney's mentor or muse or somebody like that. And it wasn't fair to Paul. And Paul really felt like he had to kind of get back to proving that he was just as important as John and on equal footing as John. And I salute Paul for that, and I think he was right. But I've always said that the tide has now turned, and it's turned grossly the opposite way. We're sitting here now, it's no longer 1980, it's no longer 1985, it's no longer 1990 or the early 90s or around the anthology in 95. We're sitting here, it's 21st century, it's the year 2017. John Lennon has been dead now for almost 37 years. New generations have grown up, generations of kids and teenagers and 20-somethings who never really knew John Lennon, never really were alive when John Lennon was here. So all they have as a reference point is really Paul McCartney. To a lesser extent, Ringo Starr, but Paul McCartney. Paul successfully, in my opinion, took back that respect and adoration that he craved, what he felt he was losing in John's larger-than-life shadow. John was this kind of martyr, like Martin Luther King or JFK, somebody who got shot and became so perfect and like a saint because of it. Paul McCartney, since around 1989, has successfully been back on the touring circuit. He's playing this year in my area. He's going to do several shows in my area later this year, and I'm going to see him again. And I am always thankful and grateful that Paul McCartney is able to carry the torch for the Beatles, if you will, to be somebody out there to keep the legacy alive. But what Paul has also done is he's kind of taken himself, in my opinion, out of the shadow of John Lennon. So much so to the extreme that now it's all about Paul McCartney. These young people who grew up knowing only Paul's new music have gone to see Paul McCartney many times in concert with their parents or with their friends or by themselves. And it's gotten to the point now where sometimes people forget there was a guy called John Lennon in this band too, And that's what I'm saying. While it was tragic and unfair in the 80s and 90s, and maybe a little beyond that, for John Lennon to kind of like his death to kind of like take all the attention away from Paul, now we're going the other way where it's all about Paul McCartney. There's people who think that Paul McCartney was the Beatles and that John Lennon was secondary to Paul now. So we've gone the other way. And two wrongs don't make a right. And John lives now in Paul McCartney's shadow. And I already have a video elsewhere in my list here of videos about John Lennon versus Paul McCartney, that kind of silly thing. Sometimes fans get into that. I love all the Beatles, but I have my favorites, and so on. Well, anyway, I want to get into more what I'm talking about defending John Lennon. These days, as I say, all you got to do is look on YouTube and look at a lot of videos of John. And underneath this, all these people calling him, we'll start with a hypocrite. Okay? Hey, John Lennon changed his mind a lot. One thing about John was that, and it's something I can relate to because I changed my mind a lot. Maybe one day he thinks this way, next day he changes his opinion to that. He's always searching for different answers. He was always changing his mind, looking into ideas, and maybe emerging a little bit differently as time went on. I know I do that. I don't think the same way about everything in 2017 that I did in 1990 or whatever it is, or maybe even last year or the year before. I think that's a growth. You grow, you listen, But the hypocrisy charge seems to come across a lot when people, for one thing, a lot of people out there do not understand his song Imagine. And that's something that always makes me laugh. A lot of people take the lyrics of the song Imagine, and some of them they misinterpret. And I say misinterpret not because I myself think that I'm right and everybody's wrong. No, I'm talking about John Lennon himself. John Lennon did manage to talk about the song Imagine in some of his interviews. And for example, a lot of people don't like the opening line, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try, etc., etc. No hell below us, above us, only sky. Well, the whole idea that some religious people think that when he says also, and no religion too, a lot of religious people get offended by that, and they seem to think it means that John is saying don't believe in God, don't believe in heaven. He's trying to, the song basically is just trying to put everything on an even keel. Okay? The idea of everybody kind of being on the same footing, all of us being kind of equal. Depends how you feel about that. I mean, I think everybody's entitled to have their different personalities, different quirks, different desires, what makes us a human race is that we're so diverse. So the whole thing, we can go there. I don't like putting politics into my videos too much, and I won't do that. I won't entertain a lot of politics here, so don't even bother, okay? Because it just gets too much fighting going on the channel or anywhere politics are mentioned. But as I grow, I've changed politically too. That's another thing. I've changed politically. I like to think of myself as somebody kind of in the middle. Sometimes I veer more one way, sometimes I veer more the other way, but depending on the individual topic at hand, the subject we're discussing, I may go one side or the other if you want. But John said I think it might have been his last interview, the RKO radio interview, or one of his 1980 interviews, he said about imagine no heaven and imagine no religion, he said, not to imagine no God, he says, but he meant it as in no denominations, that everybody was kind of like as one, and you didn't have different types of religions and everybody fighting within each other. Okay, that's definitely a kind of idealist, kind of, I don't know, utopian kind of thought that's maybe not very realistic, but the sentiment of the song is all right. I want to get into a line that really, really irks me when people misinterpret it. The line is where John sings in Imagine. He says, imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. People say, what a hypocrite John is. He's saying imagine no possessions, and there he is sitting in his mansion at a grand piano, and he's living in a Dakota building later, and he's got all this money and all this stuff, and he dares to tell us, lecture us about imagine no possessions. If you think that, you misunderstand the whole point of the song. The song Imagine is every bit as therapeutic for John Lennon himself as it is for anybody listening to the song. Don't forget, the second line he says is, in the song, I wonder if you can imagine no possessions. Meaning, you have everything, we have everything. And I think he's including himself in there. Imagine if we didn't have these possessions. Folks, the song is called Imagine. It's supposed to be imagine what it was like if you didn't have this, didn't have that. I'm not sitting here saying, oh, I'm a rich person, or a rich man, and I'm really actually poor. It's imagination. That's the whole point of the song. And John also, which is interesting to note, a few times when he would do the song Imagine live, he would change that second line to we. He would say, imagine no possessions. I wonder if we can. He'd include himself in there. So he means himself. Yeah, I'm sitting here and I have possessions. Yeah, sure, I have a lot of stuff. I have a lot of wealth, money, fame, everything. But imagine what it would be like if I didn't have this. Imagine what it would be like if you didn't have this. I wonder if we can. I wonder if you can. It's just an imagination. And it's very therapeutic. But then we get into the whole thing about John being a so-called, these are not my words, quote, wife beater. This is a sensitive issue. John was the first to admit that he was violent, especially in his younger days. And there were stories of him when he was still a teenager, I think, still, and he slapped one of his ex-girlfriends. And there's a story of John's first wife, Cynthia, saying that he was jealous of her. Again, this is all pre-fame, pre-Beatles, where, not that it matters. I mean, and I don't condone, by the way, any of this, because you're going to get these comments that are not listening to the whole video. Right? I mean, even I do the same. I don't watch entire videos all the time. Sometimes I watch portions of videos, and based on the portions, I kind of come to some conclusion. But I don't condone hitting a woman, a man hitting a woman. I don't condone a woman hitting a man. I don't condone violence in any way, shape, or form. Please remember that. When I just say, there's a difference between somebody who slaps a girlfriend one time, and in Cynthia Lennon's case, John was jealous, from what I understand. He caught Cynthia dancing with his friend Stuart, before the Beatles were famous even, and supposedly he slapped Cynthia hard and her head went back and hit the wall. Terrible. Terrible. John was the first to say, I was a hitter. Even John, and I think it might have been the Playboy interview in 1980, I'm not sure, he says, I was a hitter. I was a hitter. And even he tends to talk exaggeration. I mean, John also said, he was on LSD, he said, I must have had 1,000 trips. He doesn't literally mean 1,000 trips. And when he says he's a hitter, he doesn't mean he hit 1,000 women, or he could habitually beat up his wife. The term wife beater is something I hear all the time. There's a bunch of misguided people. Oh, Lennon was a wife beater. First of all, at the time that he struck Cynthia, they weren't husband and wife. Not that that changes anything. It doesn't matter. I'm not saying that makes it okay. Just technically, it's not correct. And I know I'm going off track because there's so many things I want to say. You want to see a habitual wife beater, quote unquote. I don't know if any of you remember. You can look it up. There was this monster, Joel Steinberg, who beat up his wife, Hedda Nussbaum, back in, I think, the mid-'80s. And I remember seeing horrible pictures of this poor woman showing up, and she was all scarred, and her face looked all swollen and hideous because she was repeatedly physically abused by this man. That's a wife beater. Okay, so all I'm doing here is trying to use semantics. I'm saying, look, I don't excuse John for what he did. John Lennon himself didn't excuse for what he did. But there's a difference between a habitual wife beater and a couple of incidents, is what I'm trying to say there. Now, as far as this business about John being a fake, a phony, somebody who preached, even his son Julian says, Dad would go around preaching love and peace to the world, but he couldn't even do love and peace in his own family, beginning with me and Mum. Well, the whole thing with that is, you have to kind of understand too, again, self-therapy. This whole stuff with John was a journey. He was on a journey to self-discovery. He was a violent man. in his youth who was gradually becoming more and more peaceful. A man who really didn't treat women that right and thought of them kind of as second-class citizens in his youth, who grew and became stronger, and through the help of Yoko Ono, somebody that people don't like, but nevertheless, she helped him become more aware of women's plight in the world, and he became more of a feminist. John Lennon became more sympathetic to women, and he wrote the song in 1972, "Woman is the Nigger of the World," which basically was taking the side of women and saying, hey, women are mistreated. You know, it's not right. And in later years, of course, by the time he died, by the time he was middle-aged, he turned the age of 40, he had done the song Woman, which is a beautiful song on the Double Fantasy album. And Woman starts out saying, for the other half of the sky, because he's pleading and praising all women. In his own words, he said, Woman is a song to Yoko, but it's also to all women. You know, he realizes now the error of his ways. Life is a learning process, you know. It's one thing to have a kid in his 20s, teenage years, 20 years, very angry, very hostile through his own bitter past, becoming like that. And, you know, you feel sorry for those who had to endure him in the wake of his being misguided. But later on, you know, he became better. So I think that when he was singing Give Peace a Chance, I think when John was singing Imagine This, Imagine That, I think he was just as much including himself in there and trying to self-therapy himself very therapeutically to try to get himself to calm down, to be more at peace, to be more respectful of people, to try to work out his own inner demons through his music. So that's why I cut him slack with that. You know, then we have another thing that people love to say. They love to talk about John as being unsympathetic to people who are handicapped, who are different. That's a new thing that cropped up over the few years. You know, we had this routine where people were talking about John Lennon when he used to go on stage and he would do a spastic act, they call it, you know. He would say, everybody clap your hands and stamp your feet. You know, he would start going like this and doing stuff like that and stamping his foot like a handicapped person. And Paul McCartney even said that was John's, not only his sense of humor, but his own way of dealing with that because he couldn't handle it. He was kind of freaked out a little by it at the time. But the point is, you know, now everything's so politically correct. They just did a movie, Ron Howard's 8 Days a Week, and I noticed on the Washington Coliseum footage, Paul McCartney says, clap your hands and stamp your feet. Just as John's about to go into his act, they cut it off. You know, so you can't have that in there anymore. But you know, all these things we're saying about John Lennon, John would be the first one to tell you that's how he was. He would tell you he could be a bastard. He would tell you he could be a lousy dad. He could tell you he was a lousy husband to Cynthia. He would tell you all this. He would own it. He'd write a music about it, and he'd try to work it out, and he'd try to improve. I mean, nothing he could do about what's already been done. And on that note, I want to finish with the subject of young, well, not young anymore, but John's first son, Julian Lennon. Nothing against Julian. He seems like a great guy. Very nice, sensitive young man. Now he's an older man. I keep forgetting his age. But, you know, a lot of us went through divorce, you know, and a lot of us had fathers that weren't that great. My own biological father was nothing to write home about, you know, and I'm a child of divorce. And I understand that my dad was around the same age as John Lennon. When I was born, my dad was only, let me think, when I was born, my dad was 22. Ironically, the same age as I think John was when Julian was born. 22 years old, folks, is a child. 22 years old, a person hasn't even figured out how to get their life in order. 22 years old, a person doesn't even have it all together yet. He still has a lot of maturing to do. Good for you. God bless you if you're 22 years old. You got it all figured out. And in John Lennon's case, try to consider this. His girlfriend was Cynthia Powell. They were an item. They were lovers, but they were not yet married, and when Cynthia became pregnant with Julian, the baby eventually became born just at the time when the Beatles were just starting to make it, in April of 1963. Beatlemania was just about to strike in Britain on around October, I think. It was already starting up. Now, let me ask you people out there, people who are always picking on John, and John would be the first one to tell you he was a lousy dad to Julian. He admitted it. Nothing you're going to say here is going to make him realize something he didn't already know. He owned up to it, faced it, admitted it, and tried to do better in later years. But how many people out there know what it feels like to have a baby born just as you're becoming one of the biggest superstars on the planet and have to tour all over the world, the globe? It's not John's fault that he became super famous and he couldn't see Julian except once every year, a couple of years or something. He was out constantly on tour with the Beatles. And the sad thing is that, to this day, Julian kind of seems to hold a grudge. And the thing is, it's not good for you to do that. John was the first one to say he was a lousy dad. All he could do was, in later years, he tried to make it up best he could to Julian. I mean, there's plenty of photos. You don't take my word for it. Look all over the internet under photos of John with Julian, and you'll see him in early days with Julian. You'll see him in the 1967 and 68 with Julian, the early 70s. John saw Julian as best he could. There's pictures of him at Florida with Julian. There's pictures of him with Julian on the set of meeting the cast of Happy Days with the Fonz. Okay? He did the best he could. He made mistakes. He said he made mistakes. He said he was a lousy dad. And he tried in later years to make it up best he could to Julian. And fortunately for Sean, his second son, he doted on Sean almost excessively. And he learned from his first failure as a dad with his second one. Of course, that's no solace to Julian, poor Julian. I'm just saying, at 50 some odd years of age now, it's time to just, suck it up, and just try to, that's what I have to do. It's what I've done. I did that with my teenage years and 20s. I got over that a long time ago, things about my dad not being a perfect dad, I just don't get it. So I know where I'm coming from with that. And as I say, in the case of Julian, you got to understand in John Lennon's case, the guy's a mega superstar with the Beatles. A son right on the doorstep, just as they were about to take off. I mean, when they got into America and went on the Ed Sullivan Show in February '64, Julian wasn't even a year old yet. So again, I'm not excusing John for everything. The end. I want to wind this up. I see it's already been over 20 minutes, 22 minutes now. But I think this had to be said. I'm just tired of it. I don't. The last thing I want, and the last thing John Lennon wanted, was for him to be hailed as a saint, as a god, who can do no wrong. John always told you, hey, I'm a bastard, I'm human, I'm imperfect, I'm paranoid, I'm this, I'm that. That's why I always loved John, because he was always imperfect. He was like one of us. And he didn't profess to be something that he really wasn't, for the most part. And I just think that, whereas he was deified as a saint and would have said, screw that, if he was alive back then, right after he died, he was like held up as some kind of a god. And Paul McCartney was right. These days, it's going the other way around. And every time you hear about John, it's always as a stooge. It's always as somebody who was a lousy dad, an abusive, misogynistic woman hater, an unsympathetic jerk with cripples, a person who, I won't even take the time to get into what people say about him being mediocre as a musician. I'll take a little time, maybe. Now it's as if, we used to think, there were times when people thought that John was even better than Paul, artistically. And that's not really where I'm trying to go with this video. But now I'm just saying it's gone the other way around. It's like Paul did everything. I actually met a young guy in my record store one day who watches this channel, and he said to me, but Paul was the guy who had all the ideas, right? He said Paul was the guy who wrote the music, and he made all the arrangements, and and it was John. Then he would go back to John and show him. He really thought, the guy's I think 18 years old at the time. This guy really thought, this kid, that it's all about Paul. People are thinking that. So let's not forget about John, and let's remember that even though while John was a real rat fink and a really troubled person, and not the good guy all the time who could be a real bastard by his own admission. Let's remember there was also good sides to John. I think the good sides are what people are forgetting about these days. Imagine that.